Our speaker today is Professor Nick Hopper from the University of Minnesota, who, as many of you of course know, works on lots of things privacy enhancing technology and lots of things Tor. Over his sabbatical, he was the Tor research director, and today he's going to talk about secure load balancing in Tor with Peerflow.
All right, thank you, Ian. All right, and this is work that was done with my friends and colleagues at the Naval Research Lab, and also with Aaron Segal while he was an intern at the Naval Research Lab. Okay, so I have a generic Tor intro slide, but I don't really need to explain much about Tor to this audience. Tor, there are onion routers. We call them relays. You build circuits. You want to be anonymous. There are directory authorities. Okay, so way back in 2004, when the Tor paper was published, everyone modeled Tor as having this property that when you wanted to build your circuit, you chose an entry node with probability 1 over the number of relays, and then you chose a middle node with probability 1 over the number of relays, and you chose an exit node with probably 1 over the number of relays. And people realized that was probably not the best way to choose circuits, because, well, you know, when you've got these relays which are run by volunteers, there's large differences in the sort of capacities of these relays. So there are some relays even today that are contributing hundreds of kilobytes per second of bandwidth to the network, and there are others that are contributing hundreds of gigabytes per second of bandwidth to the network. And so if you chose them all equally, you would have some that were really sad because everyone was trying to use them and they couldn't push enough bits, and some that were really sad because not enough people were trying to use them and they couldn't push as many bits as they wanted to, right? And so how do we solve this? I didn't advance far enough through my slide. That's the consensus. Well, Karl Marx cat can help us. He says, you know, we should take from each relay according to his ability, and we should give to each client according to their need. Well, bandwidth and token buckets. Okay. So Tor has for a long time had this idea that, you know, you should, when you choose relays, you should weight them according to the bandwidth that they can provide. Okay? And this has several nice properties. One, of course, is that if you're choosing proportional to the bandwidth, then you will, in the long run, get the most throughput that you can get out of the network. But it also has these other properties, like that it's might be more expensive to attack the network by becoming a large percentage of the bandwidth that it provides than it is to become just a large fraction of the nodes, because you could sign up 1 million little nodes, run on home botnets or something like that. All right, so it's kind of a dual, both a security mechanism or a security idea and a performance idea that we should choose relays proportional to their bandwidth. Okay, so then the question that you might have is, all right, how do we figure out what's the bandwidth of a node, of a relay? And when Tor first started doing proportional bandwidth allocation, the answer was you just ask the relay. And the relay publishes a descriptor. It says my bandwidth is 10 megabytes per second. And you would say, okay, we'll pretend that you can provide 10 megabytes per second to the network and send you traffic proportionally to that. So it took a shocking amount of time for someone to realize that was probably not a great idea from a security perspective. But there was a paper in WPES 07, Damon McCoy, Kevin Bauer, and And all those people called low resource routing attacks, they said, hey, we could just lie. And everyone would believe us. And so the idea is that if you just put some ridiculously high bandwidth in your descriptor, you'll get chosen almost all the time, or your relays will get chosen almost all the time, and then you can run these correlation attacks and de-anonymize Tor users, and that wouldn't be so good. And so after that paper, or concurrently with the publication of that paper, Tor had the sort of stopgap measure of saying, all right, well, we'll just ask you what your bandwidth is, but if you tell us something that's too high, we'll just say, that's not really your bandwidth, and just cap it at a certain amount, which I think at the time was 20 megabytes per second. Okay. Now, of course, you could still lie and say that you've got 20 megabytes per second when you're really only going to provide 100 kilobytes per second or something like that. But this is also inefficient. I mean, if a relay comes along and can provide a gigabit per second of bandwidth, you're just throwing away everything above 20 megabytes per second, right? It's throughput that you're just not using because you're worried that they might be lying, right? And so eventually, Tor developed this system, this bandwidth scanning system called TorFlow. Okay, so this is what's in place right now for determining the bandwidth of a relay in Tor. Okay, and so the way TorFlow works is you take the list of all the relays in Tor and you sort them by their advertised bandwidth, what they say they can provide. And you split them up into slices of 50 relays, but 50 is just a parameter, right? Okay, and then there's a TorFlow, well, a small number of TorFlow clients and TorFlow servers. And TorFlow clients, to test the slice, will randomly build two hop circuits using relays in the slice that start at a TorFlow client, terminate at a TorFlow server, and then they'll download a file, a big file, and measure how long it took. Okay, and then they'll do that again. They'll randomly pick another two-hop circuit using relays in the slice, download the same file, and measure how long it took. That's about how long it takes. Okay, and they do that a whole bunch of times so that over time, every relay in the slice gets chosen several times, okay? And then to figure out, okay, how much bandwidth should I believe that each relay provides? Well, what they do is they take the average amount of time it took to download the file using circuits that had that relay in it. So it could have been an exit or it could have been an entry in the circuit. And they divide that by the average amount of time it took to download that file for all circuits using that slice. Okay, so that's kind of a ratio of how fast is it compared to other relays in the slice. Okay, and then they multiply that by the reported bandwidth from the relay. Okay, yes?
Does it affect if there's a big disparity between the relays in the slice?
Yes. So I mean, that's why the slices, they do them by sorting so that they should be close together. But yeah, I mean, if there's someone who's way up at the top, then that might not work so well, or someone who's way down at the bottom. Yeah.
So with the solution, no matter how much bandwidth you have, if you report, the more bandwidth you report, the more weight you're going to get. It seems that's still true.
Yes.
That's weird.
But the report is still bandwidth capped.
Because now
No, it's not capped. No
yeah,
cap.
They could have actually just measured your actual bandwidth because with the scheme obviously they can, but they don't.
Well, they can't. So the problem, right, is that there's, well, okay. I mean, so one problem, right, is that say someone comes along and says, I have a 100 gigabit per second or a terabit per second link to the internet. Well, how do you measure that?
Can you pass a 1 terabit file over?
Yeah.
But you can't slurp it down if you're lucky, 1 gigabit link.
You would be the one.
Yeah,
They're 1 terabit, but your max capacity, the maximum bandwidth you could measure is the capacity of your bandwidth.
But certainly you could just say, oh, this is as much as I can measure, so you could measure everything below that. Or you could split your measurement across several different things, which all go and ask that at the same time. You can split your measurement across several different connections, each of which can handle maybe 1/20 of the file, and then you can measure 1 terabit per file.
Hold that.
Okay.
That's part of
You should repeat questions when people ask them.
Got it. Okay. So Tal asked a question which is, couldn't you do something very much like the system I'm about to describe to you in a few slides? And the answer is, yes, you could. But that is not what TorFlow does. All right. So this is how TorFlow works. And so notice that there's a few kind of issues here. So one is that the higher you report your bandwidth, the higher your weight will be. Right? It's just a linear weight. And another is that it's always possible for a relay to tell when it's being measured, because either it's exiting to a TorFlow server, or it's being the entry for a TorFlow client. Okay, and so this has been reported before. For example, there was I think it was an Oakland 13 paper that talked about these problems offhand, while they were also talking about some other problems with hidden services. But just for completeness, we showed that you can combine these two effects to get a really high consensus weight while providing very little bandwidth. So of course, we only did this in shadow. We didn't actually attack the Tor network. But so here's a result of a shadow experiment where we tracked the consensus weight of 2 relays. One is an honest relay, that's the black one, or the one without stars, and one was an attacker. And both of them reported that they had 1 gigabit per second of bandwidth, but the honest relay actually did have a 1 gigabit link. And on the other hand, the attacker only provided service when it was on a Tor measurement circuit, and only provided service at, I think it was 100 megabits per second, or some lower rate. Okay, and so you can see that the attacker, right, so the green axis shows that the attacker's weight was higher than the honest node's weight,
Dotted green.
the dotted green,
It's like horizontal.
right? So the dotted green is the honest, right? And the star dotted green is the attacker, right? But the bandwidth, the actual data transferred by the attacker was almost nothing.
You're including the TorFlow measurement?
Yes,
Okay.
because the TorFlow measurement is actually not that much.
What's the size of the file?
Am I including the TorFlow measurement in the data transferred? That's the only thing we're including in the data transferred. So, I mean, it's very small. I think it might be a 100 kilobyte file, something like that. So you can see that it doesn't sort of show on the scale as being much above 0. Okay, so this is bad. You can have a very high consensus weight while not really providing any service at all to the network. Okay? All right. So, there have been other systems. Okay, so there's sort of this inherent problem if you're going to do this scanning that you have to somehow try to disguise the fact that you're scanning, right? TorFlow obviously doesn't. There have been other systems that try to get around this by not scanning and instead doing something else. So the previous system, the one that's been published, is this system called EigenSpeed. Okay, and obviously my animation didn't quite work out how I wanted it to, so I'll just advance it a little bit and then it'll be okay. Okay, so in EigenSpeed, the idea is that instead of sort of having a dedicated scanning infrastructure where you've got clients trying to figure out how much bandwidth someone is giving, you instead have all the relays constantly measuring every other relay. Okay, so we've got this relay, we're going to have all the other relays constantly trying to measure this relay. And then periodically, these relays will report on their measurements. Okay, will report on their measurements to, say, the directory authorities, and the directory authorities will somehow aggregate these measurements to produce a bandwidth estimate that everyone uses. Okay. Okay, so so that's the, sort of a general idea, and in EigenSpeed, how do they make this work? Well, there's two kind of key questions. So how do the relays produce an estimate about the bandwidth they get from relays? Well, basically every time in EigenSpeed, basically every time you see a connection from another relay, you measure the bandwidth on that connection, and you look at, okay, what was the bandwidth estimate I had for the connection before, and you do compute a, what do they call it, an exponentially weighted min-max average. So you take alpha times the maximum of those two numbers plus 1 minus alpha times the minimum. Okay? Or the other way. Okay? Yeah?
So this is like an opportunistic
Right.
way of measuring as you use the circuits.
Right. So as you see traffic from these relays, you're always trying to figure out, okay, what's the bandwidth of this relay right now?
So everyone that is a measure.
Yes, everyone is measuring everyone else.
And that will hide that they're being measured.
Well, it won't hide that they're being measured.
I mean,
It's just
the fact
that
is-
they're always being measured. It's not a separate procedure that you can somehow try to game, right? Because we're always just keeping track of what you're doing. Okay? All right. So that's how each relay estimates the bandwidth that another relay can provide. And then they send those estimates to the directory authorities, and then the directory authorities have to take those estimates and sort of somehow combine them into a global weights. Okay, and in EigenSpeed, the way that works is they treat these, you kind of get a matrix of measurements, right? So you've got each row would be the measurements of some relay provided by all the other relays. And in EigenSpeed, we normalize those rows so that each row, or we normalize the columns, I guess, so that each column is like, here's my estimate of what fraction of all the bandwidth this relay made, what fraction of all the bandwidth this relay made, what fraction, okay. And then once we've got that normalized matrix, we find the principal eigenvector of that matrix. So it's the set of weights where if we picked according to those weights, and got bandwidths according to those bandwidths, we would get those weights back again. Okay? So we solve for the principal eigenvector, and that vector of weights is the weights that we use. Okay? So the idea is that it should, hopefully it should normalize to this value. Okay. And there's some extra security measures that go in on top of this. Okay. But there's a few problems with EigenSpeed. The first problem is it's not very accurate. Okay, because EigenSpeed still has this problem which came up earlier. If my bandwidth is 100 megabytes per second, I'm never going to be able to measure someone who has a higher bandwidth as having a higher bandwidth than 100 megabytes per second, right? So this is just, I grabbed the claimed, or no, the measured bandwidths of all the Tor relays sometime in July. I think I made this graph. I just grabbed their measured estimates and their measured bandwidths and said, okay, this relay would have said, okay, imagine this relay accurately measured the bandwidth of everyone lower than it and measured its own bandwidth for everyone higher than it. Okay, and then said, what would EigenSpeed compute? So just imagine that everything worked perfectly, right? What would EigenSpeed compute as the weights versus what the actual weights are? And you can see that, so for the kind of low bandwidth relays, we're doing pretty good. But for the high bandwidth relays, we're sending them like, we're underutilizing them by a factor of 7, 8.
But the weights have gone up to 1. How can it always be less than?
Maybe you didn't normalize that.
Yeah, I think that I didn't normalize the vector.
Okay, so if you normalized it, it would be a little higher, but still flat and not a nice diagonal
Yes.
line.
Yes. Yes. Tarek.
So it also has probably to do with the composition of the network with the ratio of high bandwidth relays and low bandwidth relays. And here, it's the majority are low bandwidth.
Yes.
Right? Even though they don't provide that much bandwidth. It's just that they're the ones that are causing EigenSpeed to be so. It's because
That's-
the majority of them are low bandwidth relays.
That's right. That's right. So this is, well, so I mean, because you solve for the principal eigenvector, the fact that they're low bandwidth, that it shouldn't matter too much that they're, because you discount, basically the weighting discounts them, right? Discounts the estimates of those low bandwidth guys. Yeah, I mean, so they only add up to, like 25% of the weight or something like that. But just because everyone is going to be low, for example, on the highest estimate, right? Everyone is going to be low because he's like twice as fast.
Yeah, but just to follow up on Tarek's comment, right? It's not just the proportion of high bandwidth to low bandwidth. It's also, for example, if I'm high bandwidth and my neighborhood is all low bandwidth, then does it really matter that I'm measured as high bandwidth? Because anyway, when the actual communication happens, it doesn't matter that I'm beefy, right?
It's a clique,
So-
though.
Yeah, it's a click.
The circuits are.
Tor is a clique topology, so there's no
Oh, I
neighborhood.
see. Okay,
Yeah.
all right. Question. The question answered itself. Yeah.
All right. Okay, so I mean, even with no attacks, EigenSpeed is not very accurate. But also, turns out that there are some attacks. We talk about a few different attacks in our paper. So one is this question of, okay, what weight do I assign to relays that haven't been measured yet, right? And so in EigenSpeed, they get assigned this label unevaluated, and it means give them 1/n of the weight. And so if your weight is less, if your bandwidth is less than the average bandwidth, you get a boost by not having been evaluated. So if you just keep on churning again and again, you can always sort of escape this observation, right? Now you could set that to some other value. So this is kind of a, all right. Another problem is what I sort of think of as the one bad apple attack. So the exponentially weighted min-max average is heavily influenced by that one really good circuit that you had, right? So if I want to look like I have a really high bandwidth, I use a lot of bandwidth one time, okay, to convince Ian, the other relay, that I have high bandwidth, and that gets incorporated into his EWMMA. And then every other time I talk to him, I'm like, yeah, whatever, really slow. But he keeps on taking that max and weighting that max down just a little bit every time. And so even though in aggregate I'm not pushing too many bits, he'll have been influenced by that one measurement, right, and think that I'm providing a lot of bandwidth. And then another attack that we talk about in the paper is an extension of an attack that Snyder and Borisov talked about in the EigenSpeed paper, which they thought they had solved. There's this idea of a framing attack where you have a large set of, you have a set of relays, and they all report high bandwidth for each other, so they're colluding. And then they report low bandwidth for some other relays. Other relays disagree about them having high bandwidth, but because they all report high bandwidth for each other, they can get a large weight. Okay, and the way that EigenSpeed tries to defend against this attack is that it has this idea of trusted seeds, relays whose bandwidth we somehow know is good, or know are high for some reason. And instead of computing the principal eigenvector algebraically, we compute it by iteration. And instead of iterating from the 1 over n vector, we iterate from a vector that only has weight in the trusted positions. And the idea is that the weight, if those framing nodes don't have high weight connections to the rest of the network, then the iterated vector will never kind of fill out over there. And so you won't end up assigning them very much weight, even though they kind of have this internal click that has a lot of weight in it. So that's the framing attack and the defense, but it turns out that you can pretty easily defeat that by having the nodes in the click actually provide some bandwidth to the trusted seed relays. It doesn't have to be high, it just has to agree with what the trusted seed relays measure their bandwidth at. And that will defeat this trusted seed process. So EigenSpeed both has some performance and some security problems, even though it sounds like maybe a better idea because you don't have these isolated measurement nodes that you can detect. Okay, so we wanted to build a system which would avoid some of these problems. So we have Peerflow, and the idea is going to be similar to EigenSpeed in that there will be opportunistic measurement of relays by every other relay. Okay, so every relay is going to pay attention to what happens with other relays and somehow contribute to an estimate of the capacity or what the weight should be of each relay. Okay, they'll report these numbers to to the directory authorities, and the directory authorities will take those numbers and produce weights. So I think one of the big ideas, yeah, in Peerflow is to say, okay, we look at both EigenSpeed and at TorFlow, and they have this problem where they're trying to measure bandwidth, but if you don't have as much bandwidth as the person you're trying to measure, you can't do it well, right? And also, if you're trying to measure bandwidth, it's easy to look like it might be easy to look like you have bandwidth once without continuously providing good bandwidth, okay? And so in Peerflow, instead of trying to measure bandwidth, what we measure is traffic. How many bytes total are relays sending? Okay. Okay. And anyway, so that's easier to measure because it's a counter. Okay. And anyways, it probably captures the cost of running a relay more accurately these days anyways, because the way you usually pay for bandwidth is not by the width of the pipe, but by how much you pump through it, right? So
are you measuring good put, or like if TCP packets get retransmitted, do they count multiple times or not?
no. We are not measuring, so we're not measuring retransmits, we're measuring cells.
Right. So you're measuring application level.
Application level. Yep. Okay. So, right. So, given that idea, here's kind of maybe a straw man idea for how you might think we could go about producing these estimates. You know, we could just have each relay keep track of how many bytes it sees from every other relay, and then at consensus time or some other kind of useful interval, each relay would send, report to the directory authorities, this is how many bytes I saw from every other relay, and the directory authority would just say, okay, well, in total we saw 25, 34, 50, 60 gigabytes from this relay over here in the last hour, so its capacity is 60 gigabytes per hour, or whatever number makes sense there. I didn't. Okay. Yes, Tarek?
Do you get timestamps of when this data was for each packet, like when it was transmitted? Like, are you doing it as a time series where?
Right. So there's a measurement interval, right? So at the start of the interval, I set the counters. Do we get timestamps of the data? So the way one might imagine it working is that there's a measurement interval, right? So like every hour, right? So at the start of the hour, I set the counters to 0 for all the relays, and then every time I see another cell, I increment the number of bytes that I've seen from that relay, and then at the end of the hour, I have this number. I send it to the directory authority, and then I reset my counters. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. All right, so this sounds like a reasonable, well, it might sound like a reasonable thing to do, but I mean, it's not very secure if we're worried about an attacker who's trying to increase his capacity. Well, you just report really large number of bytes seen from your colluding relays, and you'll get a really large capacity, right? So,
Wouldn't that just stand out from everybody else's?
well,
Measure capacity.
I mean, so of course it would be different from everyone else's, but I mean, yeah. I mean, I haven't described any additional security mechanisms at this point, right? Okay.
And did you also say, so is this traffic that was actually sent by real clients, or is this kind of traffic that's being sent by the probes, like the
This is just actual, every time I see another byte of traffic from that relay,
So that means
it goes in the counter.
the times at which clients don't want to communicate would affect the...
Sure. But of course, everyone would be affected equally. All right, so we need something that's a little bit more robust than just adding up all the values, right? So another kind of important insight or idea in Peerflow is that the amount of traffic that I see from a relay actually lets me estimate the amount of traffic that other people will see from that relay, because I know the weight with which clients are choosing me after that relay. So I know the proportion of that relay's traffic that I'm seeing. Okay? So if I see, 16 gigabytes of traffic from that relay, and I know that I'm 1/5 of the network, for example, then I can guess that that relay has sent about 80 gigabytes of traffic in the last hour. Okay? All right, and so a sort of second refinement of that straw man might be to have every relay record how many bytes it sees over a measurement interval. And then instead of reporting the raw number of bytes it saw, report that estimated traffic amount to the directory authorities. And then the directory authorities can build some kind of robust aggregation of those estimates. Okay, so for example, they might take the median estimated traffic amount for a relay. Okay, and this would prevent this attack, right, where just a few colliding relays report really high estimated traffic amounts, because unless you have half the relays, you can't change the estimates. Yes, Tarek.
This assumes, or are you assuming that you will max out the capacity to know what that guy's capacity is? Like it is always functioning at capacity versus it has a lot more capacity, just never gets utilized.
Right, so yes, we're assuming that the network runs at essentially full utilization. So there is a question of how do I get my weight up to my capacity initially. There's a separate bootstrapping protocol which I'm not going to describe in the talk today, but which exists. Okay? Okay. Right, so that sounds like it's an improvement. One problem here is that, of course, the median, you sort of wind up in a similar situation to earlier, where the median might be influenced by many very small relays. Right, so if I join up 6,000 relays, each of them providing 20 kilobits per second, and then have them all vote really high for each other, they can all, they will all be able to set the median vote, right? Or 7,000, or whatever the number of relays is currently in the network. Okay? So, I mean, part of the reason we have weighting is so that it's hard to just sign up these wimpy nodes and do useful things with them. You can imagine that we could modify this to get rid of that problem by, instead of taking just a median, we take a weighted median. So that means we sort the estimates, and then we start with the lowest estimate and add up the weight attached to each vote until we get to 50% of the weight, and that will be our weighted median estimate. Okay. And that's starting to sound like a more reasonable thing to do, because now, I mean, if you already control 20%, or if you already control 50% of the weight, well, Tor is.
But is the voting weight the same as the traffic weight? Yeah, okay.
But is the voting weight the same as the traffic weight? Right, so this, of course, leads to the possibility of sort of a feedback attack where my voting, my traffic weight goes up a little bit, that gives me more voting weight, which pushes my traffic weight up a little bit, which increases my voting weight, until eventually my voting weight is very high, even though my traffic weight is low. Okay. All right, so, but it turns out that there's one more idea that we can apply, and that will actually let us prove a bound on how bad things can get. Okay, and so the idea is that we're going to take a trimmed mean, a p-trimmed mean, and what that means is we throw out the top p fraction of weight on votes, and we take the average, and we also don't let someone's capacity go below 1 minus p times their previous capacity estimate. And so what this does is it gives us more information about the votes. It means that you can't, it prevents a deflation attack where you vote negatively for other relays and have their weight go down, so that your weight will proportionally go up, even though your capacity isn't affected by that attack, right? And so these two combinations, it turns out, for sort of small, but for adversaries whose true bandwidth fraction is at most 8%, we can prove that the feedback attack will be prevented. You won't be able to indefinitely increase until you become a majority of the network in terms of weight. Although there's still some kind of, there's still some bound. You can see here, for example, that if you control 8% of the true bandwidth, then the feedback attack can get you up to something like 18% of the true bandwidth, or maybe 19. Yes?
Question. Did you pick, say, 8% because it was reaching the 20% mark? Because I sometimes...
No, 8% is actually, I don't think it's, so 8% is actually the threshold in the complicated theorem that Aaron Jansen proved. All right. It has to do with the fact that there are several attacks that he kind of layered up on top of each other here. So it doesn't come from anything obvious about the thresholds here.
Let's say an adversary had more than 8% and was able to do this attack.
Yep.
By monitoring the consensus, could you at least notice this attack was happening?
I mean, so plausibly you could. It gets into, so like some of the tricks you have to do here are that you will, so we can't measure the outflow of bandwidth from exits. So you'll one of the things you do to cap this is that you just never deliver traffic on an exit circuit. And that's like a factor of 2. And so certainly exit scanners will notice that, right? And of course, depending on how big of a set you distribute these weights over, people will probably notice that everyone else's, my consensus weight is going down, and then there's this set that's going up. But I can't, there's no definite algorithm I can give to notice it at the moment. Make sense? Okay. All right. So one other scheme, if we really are worried about more than 8% of the bandwidth of the network colluding, and we have a set of trusted relays, we can do better. And the way this works is, say there's a set of relays in the network that we know are not colluding, and they have a large fraction of the bandwidth in the network, but not majority, like 15%. Okay, which right now I think the top 60 relays in the network provide something like 18 or 19% of the bandwidth. So that's maybe plausible. You could go and visit these people and decide, oh yes, they're trustworthy, and you could give them these badges. Okay, so if you had these trustworthy relays, you could modify the system actually to go kind of back to the original kind of straw man, where you would have each trusted relay just count how many bytes it saw from every other relay in the network. And it would report that number to the directory authority, and we would add up how many bytes the trusted relay saw from that relay and divide by the total weight of that trusted set, and say, okay, well, that's our estimate for how many bytes that relay sent in that hour. And the one thing, or the useful thing about having the trusted relays is that we can also say, well, if we can also look at the fraction of traffic that the trusted relays sent. And if we know that the trusted relays are 20% of the network, and they come out having only 15% of the weight, then we know that someone was cheating and sending better traffic to the trusted relays than they sent to everyone else, right? So what we can do is we can rescale everyone by whatever the fraction of the network is, by whatever fraction the rest of the network exceeds 1 minus the trusted fraction. Okay? And that sort of prevents colluders from getting too out of hand, because they can never exceed sort of having to be divided back down so that the trusted set is, say, 15% or 20%. Okay?
So obviously the trusted nodes are publicly known.
Yep.
Right? And I assume they are in such places where you expect majority, like they would touch every single other. You expect circuits to go through them.
Yes. Mm-hmm. That's right.
So basically you're penalizing not just the set of, so obviously you're not penalizing the trusted, you're penalizing everyone else, that includes the bad people, plus the people who did nothing wrong as well, by readjusting their weights down to something that's acceptable.
Well, we don't know who's bad, right?
Could you not do something where you knew which circuits in that epoch were made, and you know which?
We know which circuits in the epoch were what?
Were made. You know which circuits
were made.
Or basically which relays talk to the trusted servers, right? Because you said that when they're talking to the trusted servers, they give good capacity and when they don't commit to trusted a circuit is not involving a trusted node, they give poor service.
Uh-huh.
That's why the disparity is happening,
Right.
right? Could you not try to do some sort of identification of who the bad person might be by the fact that they were serving circuits at that time, or it's like try to pinpoint like to see which relays are involved at least. Maybe like reduce the number of relays you should penalize.
Well, I mean, it's so the penalty is not that much, right? So we're, for example, the penalty. The penalty is basically, so if you assume that the network is, say, that the trusted set is, say, 15%, then everybody else gets multiplied by 1 over 0.85, or the other way around, 0.85, right? So there's not that much deflation, right? But it bounds how big the assigned adversarial weight can be. It's not great. It's not a great bound, but it's something. So for example, if you assume that 20% of the network is trusted, then an adversary that has 30% of the bandwidth will end up having at most 60% of the weight, right? But, well, I mean, you can see it's not a straight line. But so this is just another defense that we could have if we were worried about adversaries that controlled a large fraction of the true bandwidth.
So if you have a lot of middle nodes, the advantage is larger when you're a smaller node, it seems, because it's a little bit steeper. So it would be advantageous for the adversary to have a lot of middle nodes to get more weighted, accumulatively, like aggregate more weight out of it for the bandwidth they're providing.
The ratio, yes, the return on investment might be higher down here, but the absolute weight that they get assigned is also is lower, right?
On that circuit, if you have two adversaries each working for themselves, and they each have 10%, then you have the 10% trusted. Could they each reach 50%?
No.
No. Well, why? Sorry.
So
No.
It's a non-colluding adversary.
So this is a maximum of all the guys this is the maximum that you can get. Okay. And so it assumes a particular strategy on behalf of the colluders, which is that we all perform in a particular way, right?
And the honest guys are behaving. The
And
non-colluders
the
are
non-colluders,
honestly.
right?
Right, so if you have two sets of colluders, then this guy can't maximize his attack because some other guys are
Right.
also colluding,
Yes.
right? So these guys can't optimize their attack because some of the good guys are actually differently evil.
So it's like, how much would they get?
Well, there, it's a total adversary.
Yeah. Then it would just be this one,
Yeah.
right?
Would be bounded by that.
Yeah. It couldn't be more than that. Yes. Right. Okay. So that is the security aspect of Peerflow. I have 5 minutes to talk about privacy and performance. I can get there. All right, so privacy. So Peerflow is obviously introducing more information about relays to the network than you could currently get as, say, an honest but curious relay. Okay, so for example, an example of the kind of information is, say I'm relay C here, and I see some circuit, it comes from B, and it transfers 123.4 megabytes, and then at the end of the hour, I see the report from B that it saw 123.4 megabytes from relay A in that hour, then I know probably what the entry node on that circuit was. All right? And you can imagine doing more sophisticated things that might allow you to identify entry nodes of, say, hidden circuits or something like that.
So you observed that that was the only circuit that was made in that hour. Like you're keeping that information somehow as well.
Well, I mean, this is not an actual attack. It's a illustrative example, right? Okay. Okay, so Peerflow, we have two kind of defenses against this kind of leakage. One is that we add differentially private noise to the reports. And in fact, there's sort of two related things. So instead of reporting every hour for every relay, we compute the time so that we'll expect everybody to have about the same report for each relay. And that's the time that's the time period for that relay's measurement interval. Okay. And then we add some kind of Laplace noise. I'm not really sure why 1 megabyte was the amount we chose for to evaluate in the paper, but that's the amount we chose to evaluate in the paper.
The noise is added by the relay.
By each relay.
So independent of it.
Yep, each relay independently adds Laplace noise with sensitivity 1 megabyte and epsilon set to 0.1 to its value before it sends it to its estimated traffic value before it sends it to the directory authority. Right?
So when different relays talk about what traffic they oh no. I'll ask later. I have to formulate the question first.
Okay. All right. Of course, that will still. Wow. I'll just have the whole thing appear then if it won't all appear at once. All right. So that will still leak some information because, for example, if I adversarially increase the amount of traffic on one link, then that will show up in the report. Whether that report releases some other information, I don't know, but that's at least an example that some extra information could still be leaked by that differentially private scheme. So we also describe and have a way too flaky to be released to the public implementation of a cryptographic scheme. And so the idea here is that rather than relay B encrypting its noisy estimate for the amount of traffic that it saw from relay A, it takes the range between 1 minus the previous capacity estimate and the reported capacity of the node and divides that into a number of bins and puts a vote, takes its estimated traffic, noisy estimated traffic value and puts a vote in the bin that corresponds to that, and then encrypts that as like with a additively homomorphic scheme, and sends that encrypted vote to the directory authority with a threshold encryption scheme so that the directory authorities have to collaborate to, cooperate to decrypt those votes. And the directory authorities scale each relay's report by its voting weight and add them all up and then just decrypt the one final value, which lets them compute the weight while not learning the individual value of any relay. This still releases some information about what subsets might possibly have voted for different bins, which you can alleviate to a large degree by rounding the voting weights. I've got 1 minute. So we implemented this and tested it in Shadow, and it looks like Peerflow is both more accurate and more consistent in its estimates of relays bandwidths even than TorFlow. This is before we even talk about adversarial relays. Overall, though, it seems to get about the same amount of network goodput as a network that's weighted using TorFlow. So it's more secure and at least no worse in performance. Again, latency looks not all that different between TorFlow and on the ideal line is just if every relay is weighted according to its actual bandwidth, since it's shadow we know. And clients see slightly better, in our experiments, throughput than with TorFlow. Thank you for listening to me. Yeah,
So,
Tar?
because all of the relays were adding noise independently, do you find that, I mean, you picked a certain level amount of noise to add.
Mm-hmm.
Could you perhaps reduce the amount of noise? Like, it might be way more than it's actually needed. I mean, your results at the end is going to be a cumulative of all the noise added by all of the different relays. I know you weight each relay's input by its weighted fraction. Is that how you're mitigating the amount, like reducing the amount of noise that is in the results? Like, basically what I'm saying is, how does it affect the utility of the answer you get at the end?
So the noise gets added after the weight
Okay.
is applied. So,
So, doesn't matter which relay it's reporting about, it's going to add noise according to, independent of what that relay is.
that's right.
So I'm just wondering if maybe there's a way of adding less noise so you get more utility out of it, yet still have the same level of security. It's sort of like what Privex does, say, for instance, right? Just trying to see like if there's a way of adding the noise that's maybe takes into account some information about the relay itself, like its weighting or something. That's what we use the weighting. Instead of just everyone adding some set amount of noise, regardless of how big that relay is or how small that relay is.
Well, so in Privex you have private aggregation, right? And the scheme with the noise in Peerflow, that's public aggregation, right? So everyone reports those values directly to the directory authority, so the directory authority gets to see them, right? So you can't.
Oh, the scheme with the encrypted bins doesn't have noise in it?
No.
Okay.
Oh, okay. I was inflating those two.
Yeah, right. I'm sorry.
Okay.
So you could have the noise, I guess, as an extra defense against the aggregators. In which case, then, yeah, I guess you would need less noise because.
So each relay uses its weight to figure out, okay, well, if I'm seeing this much, that means the total amount must be this much.
Mm-hmm.
So that's assuming that the set of circuits going through the node is at least statistically distributed according to the weights. Sometimes you know that's obviously not true, like if you're in the same /16 as the other guy. But you can take that into account for public things. But for things like I have no idea how often Tor clients set the must exit in Iran knob, right? And that will totally change the weight distribution, but in a way you have no way of knowing. So do we have any idea how often clients choose circuits not in the default way?
No.
Sounds like something Privet should measure.
Yeah, I'm supposed to make some additions. Yeah, but
Yeah, I don't know. I would guess not very. Because everyone just downloads
Right.
Tor browser bundle and doesn't even know there's this thing called .torrc.
Right,
Right.
but the newer Tor browser bundles actually have nice graphical configure widgets to let you do things like set the privacy level of Tor, and I don't know what else nowadays, but it would not surprise me. Like Vidalia certainly had this
Right.
graphical thing.
Yeah.
Tor browser bundle has moved away from Vidalia, but I thought the plan was to put more of Vidalia, like it has the pretty map of the world graph,
Okay.
right? So I
Yeah.
don't know. I suspect it may become easier to do
Perhaps.
non-standard things with your Tor client.
set your privacy level?
Yeah.
How do you measure that?
It's not your Tor privacy level, it's your browser
it's
privacy
your browser
level.
privacy level.
Oh,
It's-
what
It's
information
whether you do
is-
JavaScript,
Yeah.
whether you do Flash. No, you can't do Flash, but.
Okay.
Yeah,
Talk
done.
about the figure I was asking about. I was just thinking about that.
I'm sorry?
The figure I was asking about.
Okay, sure.
Like 10% trust, 20%.
Uh-huh.
Just thinking, just thinking this actually, here beneath this graph, apparently, there is a multiplier. The multiplier is as a attacker, how much you can multiply your own apparent balance. And that
Uh-huh.
multiplier is actually fixed for each of the 3 lines. And for example, if you look at the 10% trusted graph, the multiplier is actually 9. If you have 0.1, you can multiply yourself to 0.9, but you can't affect the other 0.9, so therefore you get a 0.5. You have 0.2, you multiply by 9, you get 1.8. You still can't affect the other 0.9, so you get 1.8 divided by 2.7, which is exactly 66%, which we have there. So this graph is actually based on that. There is a fixed multiplier to how much you have, which also in turn answers my question, which is that if you have 2 separate coding groups, they can each multiply their bandwidth by 9 times, but of course it doesn't give them all the bandwidth. It just, for example, if each of them had 10%, now they each say they have 9 times that, but there's still 80% left, and so it would be like 180%. Well, or they don't work with each other, so there's actually 9% left, so there's, you can do the calculation for how much they have left that way. So that's apparently how this
Yep.
which is quite interesting. Anyway, that was what I just wanted to find out because I had this sort of incomplete question. Yeah.
Right.
Any other questions? Okay, thanks. Thank you.